Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this CPD session of the Estate Agency Affairs Board. My name is Chris Kluter. I'm a professor in real estate at the University of Pretoria, and this module is about commercial property management. The topics we'll be covering is all to do with the basic objective of commercial property management. So the idea is to provide an overview of the various functions, and to do that, we will address firstly the question of what property management is, what the property manager does, what the relationship is between the owner and the manager, and then the important functions of leasing and tenant relations and financial management. So firstly, let's ask ourselves, what does it mean if we say we are involved with property management? Why do we do it? And the answer is very simple. It is to achieve the objectives of the owner of the property. Now, those objectives can be either functional, that means the owner uses the property to do something, live in it, work in it, make something in it, or it could have been for commercial investment purpose, or another factor, of course, is subjective for aesthetic or status reasons, like the headquarters of a bank or even your own home. Your house is not just a house, it's your home. So quite often the management is to do with all of these different values together. But the basic objective of property management is to maintain these values. In the private sector, if we involve ourselves in property investment, normally the objective is to provide a financial return. On the other hand, if it's a public sector investment, normally the objective is to maintain the suitability for that required use. Because the public sector property may be something like a school or a hospital, and therefore the objective of the property manager is to maintain the use of that function. In both cases, however, whether for investment or for the use by the public sector, the objective of property management is to maintain the value of the property. Now, what's the advantages of having a professional property manager? Firstly, of course, property maintenance is done. That hopefully will contribute towards increased occupancy and reduced tenant turnover. You will have a better tenant relations. You'll have proper maintenance of property records, and the property manager will maintain an analysis of all the expenses and provide financial reports. And even if that is required, provide management advice to the property owner. If you ask, therefore, why should I appoint a property manager? From a purely investment point of view, it is because the property manager can add value to the investment of the property owner. Now, quite often people ask themselves the question, what's the difference then between property management, property maintenance, facilities management, asset management? Quite often these terms are used in ways which are very similar and sometimes in a confusing way. If we ask ourselves what's property maintenance, it's very simple. It is the work done in order to keep or restore a facility, like a building, to an acceptable standard. If you ask what's property management, we've already given the answer to that, and that is, it's a process directed at maintaining the value of the property. Facilities management, becoming more and more popular these days, is the practice of coordinating the physical workplace with the people and the work of the organization. If we try to put that in one sentence, it's to provide an optimum match between people and the built environment. Asset management, on the other hand, has got a more strategic function. That is the management of properties to unlock the fullest potential of these properties. So you are trying to manage a portfolio to achieve the maximum value. And this could even mean selling a property or converting the property to another use. So the main difference between asset management and property management is that asset management is strategic in intent and property management is more operational in intent. Now, of course, if you look at different kinds of properties, they require different kinds of skills. We are all familiar with the management of a residential property, which could be minimal, to, on the other hand, management of a specialized property, which could be extremely sophisticated and that may require specialized skills. To manage, for example, a hotel or hospital or game farm, you need to have a very good knowledge of that specific industry. If we talk about commercial property, in our sense, we'll talk about mainly office buildings, retail properties, that's shopping centers, and industrial properties. These are the most important commercial properties which normally is suitable for property management by an external party. If we say what's the difference between commercial property and residential property and the management thereof, in the case of commercial property, the manager is more involved with complex lease provisions. Secondly, he's more involved with sophisticated building systems. And thirdly, typically you will be dealing with fewer tenants than, for example, a block of flats. In an office block, there may be 1 or 2 or 10 tenants. On a block of flats, there may be 50 or 100. So you're dealing with fewer tenants, but they are typically more knowledgeable and require a high degree of care. In contrast to office blocks, the management of shopping centers is even more involved. There, because of the high volume of people frequenting the shopping center, there are higher levels of maintenance required, and of course security becomes a bigger concern. In addition, the shopping center manager needs to be involved with the continuous enhancement of the appeal of the center, as well as maintaining a satisfactory tenant mix. The leases in the case of a shopping center is also typically more intricate. There would be things like typically turnover clauses, exclusivity agreements, and quite often the manager becomes involved in the retailing concerns of the tenants. If we now look at the total number of functions that is required from a shopping center or a property manager in general, we can distinguish 7 broad functions. The one is maintenance, the one is leasing, one is tenant administration, one is risk management, one is budgeting, record keeping and reporting, management of expenses and income, and marketing. Not all of these are always applicable to all kinds of properties, but at least most of them are touched on in most cases. Leasing, we all know about. If you don't have a tenant in a property which is being bought for investment purpose, you don't have return on the investment. So the leasing activity includes things like marketing the space, setting the rental levels, soliciting prospects, negotiating, executing leases. From there it goes into tenant administration, where you manage the leases, including of course collection of rentals, but also keeping the tenant satisfied. That means maintaining good customer relations. Risk management, as another important function, entails the management of the different kinds of risk. Now these would be things like security, crime for example, or it could be insurance requirements, environmental concerns like pollutants, or disaster recovery. There may be something like a tsunami or a terrorist attack or robbery, and you need to recover from that disaster and assist the tenants in overcoming the negative effects. Maintenance, we've already talked about. Maintenance is a combination of all the activities required to retain the item, whether it's a lift or the whole building, into the state in which it can fulfill its required function. Management of expenses and income. You need, as property manager, to maintain the proper records and report to the owner. So you must actively manage the income of the rent, included in that would be things like recovery of operating expenses, making sure that VAT is recovered, and being responsible for the expenses. especially rates and taxes, water, electricity, insurance, maintenance, staff, etc. You need to fulfill the financial management function as far as budgeting, record keeping, reporting is concerned. Financial statements, which include the income statement, balance sheet, cash flow statements, rent rolls, building reports, turnover summaries, and very important is you need to communicate regularly with the owner. That function is one of the most important ones because a property investment is normally runs into very large numbers, and whoever the owner is, they want to know how that property is doing, whether there are tenants, what the problems are, whether there are incomes which are in arrears, or whatever the case is. So communicate regularly. Marketing, of course, more important in the case of some properties than others. For a shopping centre or hotel or casino, for example, you require a bigger marketing input than a normal office building. And these could include PR, promotions, publicity, and of course community relations. Typically, a shopping centre plays a very important role in the community, and the shopping centre management quite often therefore is involved with playing some or other community role, whether it is subsidizing a school function or having a Tuesday morning tea function for ladies in the area. Now, we can summarize or encapsulate all these functional areas into three critical areas: marketing, finance and admin, and physical management. And you will see from that diagram that everything we've been talking about is encompassed in one of these three broad functions. The physical management, things like physical safety and security, building maintenance, plant and equipment maintenance, cleanliness, hygiene. Secondly, marketing, including leasing, tenant relations, public relations, community relations, promotions, publicity. And thirdly, finance and administration, like general administration, leases, expense control, recoveries, supplies, and personnel management. Having said all that, a very important component is the relationship between the owner and the manager. We are going to look very briefly at the legal relationship between them, the appointment and remuneration, what the management contract should cover, and what should be done when you take over the management of a property. Remuneration, of course, important. How do you charge it? Any agreement should, of course, specify what should be paid and on what basis and when and how. And it can be either flat fee, or it can be a percentage with or without a guaranteed minimum fee, or sometimes extra remuneration for special functions which you agree on, or even a bonus. And if you ask what is a typical percentage, that varies according to the size and the complexity of the property. But if it's a very large property with a few tenants, the percentage would be lower than a property where there are maybe 50 or 100 tenants, obviously. When you sign an agreement with the owner of a property, you should address these functions or the terms which you must execute in that agreement. These include things like what's your duties, also what's your responsibilities. How far can you go, for example, in spending money without the owner's consent? How long the appointment is for, how and what you are paid and on what basis, and how do you report to the owner? What the frequency is, what the format is. Is it phone calls, SMSs, formal written reports, etc. If you take over the property as a manager, make very sure that you have all the required information. Quite often, a manager would accept the building or the property without the full records. And that makes your job very difficult if something goes wrong. You need at least a copy of the building plans, a copy of the insurance policy, the municipal account numbers, the name of the owner's attorneys, the date on which the owner expects statements, and all the other documentation like leases, rental records, tenant details, deposits received, existing maintenance, contracts, guarantees, etc. If you do not have that, and you must start looking for that when there's a problem, you will find your life becoming very difficult indeed. If you now ask yourself, do I want to become a property manager? What should I look like? What kind of person would probably be successful in property management? One can look firstly at your own background and experience. You will probably have to have a background, formal studies, or informal studies at least, in subjects like property studies, general financial management, building management and services, marketing, in the case of shopping centers, retailing, in the case of, for example, hospital, obviously medical background. You must have a knowledge of the building industry, property commercial law, and local bylaws and regulations. Your skills, in contrast to your formal knowledge, would encompass that you must be strong on interpersonal and interactive relations. You must be able to communicate well, negotiate well. You must have a good head and feeling for numbers. You must have management skills, PR skills, and even marketing skills. And all that means that you are probably going to be involved in your the property, especially if it's a big property. That property is positioned in the community, and you will have to be very flexible as far as your personal life is concerned. It is not just a normal 8 to 5 job. You may have to solve problems after hours. There may be a lift being stuck at 10 o'clock at night, or there may be a fire at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you must be able and willing to respond. Let's now look at the leasing process. Now, one will have to address which are the factors that influence the rentals, how much people pay. How do you determine it? How do you find somebody? How do you market that property? What are the steps to secure a tenant? How do you screen the tenant? How do you accept the offer? What does the lease document look like? And I'll say something on the lease arbitration and the green lease as new developments. And after you sign the lease agreement, you need to install the tenant, which means there are probably briefs on the tenant's shop fitting requirements, and you must have procedures which can be used by the tenant to make sure that their shop fitting and the installation does not clash with the requirements of the building or something like a big opening date. If you measure the area of the rentable space of the tenant, use the SAPO method for measuring rental areas. That cuts out a lot of uncertainty. And very briefly, the lettable space, how it's defined in that method, is the total floor area minus the shell and the core. And normally you measure from the outer walls to the partition with no allowance for columns or projections. The detail you will find in that SAPO method for measuring floor areas, which is available from SAPO. You also know that there will be vacancies in your building. If the economy is in recession, you will have large vacancies. Even if it's a fantastic building in the middle of a economic upswing, you are still likely to have vacancies, even if it's only because of tenants moving in and out. You are not going to be able to have 100% of the space filled 100% of the time. Another aspect you must be aware of is the difference between grade A, B and C buildings. Grade A is typically the best quality building, not older than 15 years, in a prime location, high finishes with on-site parking, advanced heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, well supplied with IT systems. A grade B building would be older but still satisfying modern standards, also with on-site parking, also with air conditioning. A grade C building, on the other hand, would be a building which is much older, which do not have those facilities, which are not satisfying modern standards, but in any case is still suitable for use, and therefore normally a building which is popular with tenants which are very sensitive as far as the rentals are concerned. If you market the product, what do you have? You may have a price advantage. That's something. This rental is lower than that one. However, if it's a good building, you're probably not marketing on that basis. You're probably marketing on aspects like it's a better building, increased efficiency. You as a tenant will be more productive in that building. That building would offer you a high prestige, or it will be more economical to occupy because there's on-site parking, or there's public transport close by, or you have advanced tenant services, and you as the manager are able to satisfy the requirements of the client's operations to a much larger degree. Like a normal estate agent, if you want to manage a building, you must get a mandate from the owner. That mandate must be very clear, including things like, is there a specific tenant mix in mind? You don't want to, for example, mix even an office building something like a pawn shop with a high quality lawyer's office or CAs or whatever. He must give guidance on the rent and the rent escalations. You must have a clear guidance on which costs are to be borne by the tenant, and you must be very clear on what the lease periods would be acceptable to the owner and what other requirements there are. The offer to lease would of course require normal essential terms of any offer to lease. Let's assume you now have a potential tenant. How do you screen whether that tenancy is acceptable? Most important, look at the history. Find out, and don't be scared to phone the managers of previous buildings where that tenant had been. Ask whether that tenant has been a good tenant, whether they paid the rental, what the reasons are why they're moving. Secondly, look at the compatibility of the tenant with the other tenants in the building. Maybe that tenant would attract more tenants to the building if that's important. Or what about if the tenant is a kind of tenant that would require services after hours, like for example a gym or private education classes at night or something like that, that would require lighting, security, air conditioning to be active after normal business hours. Apart from the history of the tenant and the compatibility of the tenant with the other tenants, check the business reputation and strength of that tenant, whether it's a blue chip tenant or not. Then look at whether your property can actually satisfy the operational requirements of the tenant. Would the tenant require things like standby power? What about the loading on a floor? What about the trip generation of the tenant himself or the clients visiting the tenant? And then you look at the space requirements. How many square meters required? Is it a tenant who is likely to grow, therefore you want to provide for future expansion? Could you accommodate temporary needs in temporary space, for example? Or is it a tenant where you can maybe play musical chairs with the requirements of the different tenants? On signing the lease, typically, these days, most leases are triple net leases. Now, what does that mean? Long ago, if we talk about 50 or 100 years ago, typically a landlord owned a building and he would get a tenant who would pay rental, and the landlord would be responsible for everything else, paying the services, taxes, the electricity, insurance, doing the maintenance, etc. Gradually, that responsibility had been shifted over to the tenant. And these days, quite often with a triple net lease, you find that the tenant pays a basic rental, but then also a pro rata share of things like insurance or maintenance or water, electricity, rates and taxes, etc. If that is the case, it's called a triple net, and double net and single net are the cases in between. Signing a lease and having completed documentation then requires that you draw up a neat little summary, because you are going to have to be able to manage that lease. There you put in the most important aspects of that lease. Who is responsible for what, who is paying for what, and when. That is a very handy management tool for you to manage the leases, because if you can't manage the leases, a lot of the other functions are not really so important. You don't want a building that's without tenants, and all the tenants must have leases which are well managed. Let's look in summary at the end, as far as leases are concerned, at two recent aspects. The first one is so-called green leases, which has become more important with the recent trend towards green building and the general trend in the world of being more aware of environmental impact of buildings and climate change, for example. This is a lease where both the tenant and the owner agree to work together to save energy, for example, or to limit the environmental impacts of that building as much as possible. It is not necessarily a formal lease. It could include a number of aspects like, I'm the tenant, I will agree that although I'm paying for the electricity, it is in the benefit of the environment that I will save electricity, and I will make available all the records. I will tell you how much I use. And then you as owner can maybe install some procedure or apparatus or management or whatever that is to the benefit of all the tenants to save electricity. The same with water, for example, or lighting, or whatever the case is. So the so-called green lease can range from a gentleman's agreement that we work together for the benefit of the environment, to a formal agreement whereby we say we will tell both the tenant and the landlord what we do, and if we don't do it, there could be sanctions or penalties. Another recent development, in fact only in the past year, is the development of a so-called lease tribunal, commercial lease tribunal. You know, in the case of construction, arbitration has long been an accepted method of dispute resolution. In the case of large commercial agreements, when there had been disputes, the only way to settle those disputes had been to go to the court. About a year ago, a number of role players in the industry got together, and a commercial lease tribunal was introduced, which has cut down, if you follow that procedure, has cut down the cost as well as the time to settle commercial disputes, which could have profound financial implications. The advantage of this is that there's a website. You can cut down a lot of the red tape, and you can settle a dispute in a very limited time. Having signed the lease agreement now and being required to make the tenant at home in your building, typically you will have a number of briefs for the shop fitting of the tenant. These would include things like procedures for approval and submission of information by the tenant to the landlord. You will have to provide a description of the structure. For example, which lift can be used, or how wide are the doors, or what's the load which can be put on a floor. As the manager, on behalf of the owner, you will have to provide design criteria. Where can they put up the name, for example, of the tenant, inside or outside the building? What size do you allow lights? What are the shop fitting operations on site? What about hoardings? What about insurance requirements? And typically that shop fitting brief would include appendices dealing with aspects like fire control, electrical services, etc. This is a very important aspect, because this is where the tenant shakes down, so to speak, in that property. And if either he doesn't know what to require or the owner doesn't know what the tenant wants to do, you inevitably are going to run into severe problems. Let's now lastly look at financial management in a bit more detail. Of the broad functions we've discussed, financial management is very important. And here we are going to look just briefly at budgets, financial control of operating costs, financial reports, so-called KPIs or key performance indicators, and the use of computers in financial management. Firstly, a budget. If I have a budget and I use it as something which must be put in a bottom drawer, I shouldn't even draw up a budget. A budget is a tool for management. I use a budget to control my income and expenses. There typically is a very simplified version of a statement for a building. Let's assume 1,000 square meters rentable area at 80 Rand per square meter per month. That gives you 80,000 Rand per month. You add your extra income from things like recoverable operating expenses. Let's assume 20,000, so you end up with a gross income of 100,000 per month. Per year, therefore, 1.2 million. Now you need to allow for vacancies, like a percentage ranging from typically 3 to 10%. It depends on the economic climate you're in, where that building is. And then also make provision for bad debt, because you're never going to get all the income all the time. If you make allowance for those two items, you end with what's known as a gross annual collectible income, and then you need to subtract the non-recoverables. That means the expenses you have which are not recovered from tenants, and in this case you end up with a figure of 900,000 per year. Now that is the bottom line which the owner looks at, and that is the number which determines at the end the value of the building if it is to be bought or sold. So if you draw up a budget, make sure firstly that it's accurate. Secondly, yes, we all normally are a bit lazy, so we look at the previous year budget and you add 5 or 10%. That may be very misleading. There could have been, for example, a leak in a water pipe and you pay an extra 10,000 a month the previous year, and all you do now is add another 5 or 10%, and you never discovered that you could actually save money. A third requirement for drawing up a budget is that you must know the market, of course. And lastly, you must know your own property and, for example, whether you are going to have a major refurbishment shortly, repainting or replacing an escalator or refurbishing the whole center. These are 4 major requirements for drawing up a budget at all. If you now look at the financial reporting and you look at how you would like to be measured as a financial manager or manager of that building, there are a number of so-called key performance indicators. And these are just ratios which you can use to indicate whether you are doing a good job or whether the property is performing as it should. One could be average rental per square meter per month for different kinds of space or different grades of offices. A second one is how much of the operating costs are you recovering relative to the budget. A third one could be what are the costs per square meter per month if you look at things like electricity or water or assessment rates and whatever. If you have a rate, you can compare that with comparable buildings and know whether you're actually doing a good job as far as the management of energy is concerned. You can look at things like are debtors in arrears, how much of the building is let. In the case of a shopping center, things like what's the foot traffic, how many people visit the center, how many people actually use a certain entrance. And you can look at, in the case of a shopping center, at trading densities or the turnover numbers of the different tenants and compare that with how well that tenant is doing relative to other branches or buildings around the country. That gives a very good indication if your center is actually performing. Lastly, we've become so used to computers that we don't realize how much unexploited potential there is. Most of us use a computer like a cell phone for limited functions instead of using the fullest potential. We have property management software which could provide information on the property, on the management of tenants, lease management, the property owner manager, the service providers, accounting, maintenance service agreements, things like your scheduled services. It could provide information on the company and employees, on all the paper there is in the office, and these are just property management software which you can buy, whether it's proprietary developed or whether it is commercially bought by companies, vendors in South Africa or internationally. Make sure whatever you do that property management software satisfies your requirements. Latest development is that we have become very aware of the importance of knowledge. We can use computers to derive so much information on our clients. We can know and have automatic warning bells going off if we see turnovers going down, or if end of the lease period is coming up, or whatever. We can use even new developments like building information modeling, so-called BIM, which means that you can model a computer and all its components on a model of the building and its components on a computer, and you can actually, by zooming in on a specific component, get all the information on that component, like who's the manufacturer, what are the guarantees, what's the maintenance requirements, etc. So use the information to know your buildings. Secondly, use the information available about markets, and these are becoming more and more readily available from all kinds of quite often unlikely sources. It could be commercial market surveys, it could be information done for a specific purpose, marketing campaigns for example, it could be demographic data which you get from the census numbers, whatever it is. Make sure if you have the information that this information is accurate, that you understand what it means, and that you use the appropriate technology to utilize it to your benefit. If you do that, you will be hopefully a successful property manager, and hopefully have a successful career by satisfying the requirements of the property manager, the property owner, because you as manager will be maintaining the value of that property. Thank you very much.